Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 39, Animal Behavior. Something I want you guys to understand is that I will expect you to know the examples I'm giving you in this lecture on your exam. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that you watch some of the videos that are in this PowerPoint because one, they're pretty funny, and two, you get to actually see these behaviors in real time rather than having to imagine them or think you understand them based on what I'm saying. So have you ever had a bee sting? They really stink, right? Bees live in large family groups. They gather nectar from flowers and they store that nectar as honey. Beehives not only contain delicious honey, but protein-rich bodies of developing bees. So if you remember Pooh Bear from back in the day, he was always sticking his hand in the honeybee hive. A lot of different animals actually do want to eat what's in the honeybee hive because you have the honey, but you also have those protein-rich baby bees developing. Bees that sting is actually an adaptive response. They've evolved a defense to keep the hive raiders away. So bees originally didn't sting, but as more and more of their hives were getting raided, they developed the ability to sting. Bee stings are highly painful, and even a single sting can be fatal to someone allergic to honeybee venom. Humans label an animal's defense as aggressive, but if you think about it, this honeybee, he's just trying to protect his turf. He's not actively going after you to sting you. You have to provoke that. Have you ever heard of Africanized killer bees? I highly recommend that you watch this video from National Geographic discussing how they came about. Africanized honeybees, what happened was they they were being they were being researched to see if they produced more honey. And unfortunately, some researchers let some out in South America. And what happened was they started interbreeding with regular bees and they started just taking over. Vibrations from lawnmowers can provoke swarms to protect their nests. And Africanized bees respond more aggressively to a chemical alarm signal called a pheromone compared to honeybees. Remember, pheromones were those chemical communication signals that are species specific? So, what happens is when an Africanized bee smells a specific pheromone, they attack in great numbers and they sting with little provocation. So, like, you don't have to do much to make them want to sting you. One bee needs to release the attack pheromone, and then everyone in the hive will join in. And that's much different from regular honeybees. So researchers did an experiment with killer bees versus normal European honeybees. And what they did was they positioned a dark cloth outside a beehive and released the attack pheromone. Africanized bees flew out of their hives and attacked the cloth faster than European bees, and they stung the cloth 6 to 8 times more than the European bees. Why is there such a huge difference in their behavior if they're both bees? And this map shows you where Africanized honeybees live. You can see that they do really well in Florida and in Texas, and we do have some in the state of Louisiana. So part of the reason why there's such a huge difference in their behavior has to do with their genetics. And we're going to talk a lot about how genetics influences behavior in this lecture. So scientists investigate proximate causes of behavior, genetic and physiological factors, and the ultimate causes, environmental factors that favor the evolution of a behavior. And the interaction among organisms and their environment are part of the study of ecology. So ecology is a study of organisms and their environment and the interactions between organisms and their environment. So, behaviors that have a genetic basis. Much variation in behavior within or among species results from inherited differences. And if you remember from Biology 105, you inherit your genes. Rarely scientists can even pinpoint a gene responsible for the behavior because there's so many other things going on. I mean, it might be your environment, your genes, food sources, etc. Here's an example. Coastal garter snakes, which you can see here, dine on banana sea slugs. That's this red thing right here. Coastal garter snakes are genetically predisposed to recognize these slugs as food. So any garter snakes that grew up along the coastline see this red thing and they're like, oh, delicious, that's food. But if you're a garter snake that was born inland, maybe you were born up the bayou where there are no banana slugs, they do not recognize the slug as a food source. So if you put baby garter snakes in a cage and you put a banana sea slug in front of them, only the ones that are born along the coast are going to know that they're actual food. The ones that were born up the bayou wouldn't. That would be like you taking someone who is from the Midwest and never seen a crawfish, and you take them out to dinner for a crawfish dinner, and they're like, I didn't even know that these were food. Animal behavior requires a capacity to detect a stimuli. Structures of the nervous system determine the types of stimuli an animal can detect and the types of responses it can make. What parts of the nervous system detect stimuli? You guys should remember this from when we discussed your senses. So this is stimuli can be an environmental cue that you see, you hear, you smell, you taste, or you touch. Much variation within or among species results from inherited differences. Behaviors can be influenced by genes that affect the structure and activity of the nervous system, and by genes that affect metabolism and physical traits. For example, genes that specify beak structure in Africanized seed crackers are going to determine which species eat large seeds and which species eat small seeds. So here you can see that this beak is much larger and can crack larger shells, whereas this one is adapt to handling smaller seeds. That would change their feeding behavior. One way to investigate the genetic basis of behavior is to examine behavioral and genetic differences among members of a single species. So, for example, I talked to you guys about those garter snakes of the Pacific Northwest. Snakes in coastal forests prefer to eat banana slugs that are common on the forest floor. Snakes that live inland or far away from these banana slugs, they prefer to eat fishes and tadpoles. So, when offered a slug, a newborn offspring coastal snake is going to eat it. But offspring or baby garter snakes that were found inland, they ignore the banana slug. They don't know that that is possible food. So newborn coastal snakes associate slug scent with food. They don't know the gene that underlies the scent food connection, but when coastal and inland snakes are bred, offspring do associate the scent with food. So garter snakes that are born along the coast, they have a gene that tells them that if they smell a banana slug, to associate that with food and eat the banana slug. But snakes that are born inland in other forests, they don't have that gene. So when they see a banana slug, they just ignore it because they don't know that it is a possible food source. Another example of genetic variation within species would be fruit flies. So fruit flies eat yeast on decaying fruit. And when they're really young, they're actually larvae or maggots. If you've ever heard about maggots, those are fruit fly larvae. So 70% of fruit fly larvae are rovers. That means that they move around the fruit as they feed. And 30% are sitters, which means they're going to stay in one place. And what they realized was that there's actually a gene that makes them either rovers or sitters. So a fly larvae is going to act differently based on its genes. So if you're a rover, you're moving all over the fruit. And if you are a sitter, you just hang out in one spot on the fruit. And finally, sometimes inherited differences can make an organism monogamous or not. I don't recommend that you use this example if you decide to cheat on your boyfriend or girlfriend, but voles, which are these cute little furry animals here, have inherited differences in hormone receptors that influence their mating and bonding behavior. So most voles are promiscuous. That means that they go out and they have a great time and they have many sexual partners. But some voles are monogamous, which means they find their one partner and they stick with them for the rest of their lives. And so scientists really want to understand, why is it that some voles are promiscuous and going out all the time and spreading their seed, and other voles find their mate and stick with them forever? So scientists looked at the brains of a monogamous species, and what they found was that the species that only had one sexual partner had more receptors for the hormone oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is the feel good neurotransmitter. So remember, like, if you ever heard of Oxycontin, we talked about this with the drugs in your brain. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter that releases a flood of good feelings. So if you have more receptors in your brain for that, when you have sex, you're going to feel like $1,000,000. It's going to feel so good that you're not going to need to go out and find other mates. You're going to be happy with just that one mate. Promiscuous voles, on the other hand, have fewer of these oxytocin receptors in their brains. So, what they do is they need to go out and get it on over and over again to get the same feel good feeling that the monogamous voles have. So, the take home message is vole species vary in mating and bonding behavior, and it's based on the number and distribution of receptors for oxytocin, and that has to do with their genetics. So, the monogamous voles have a gene that has more oxytocin receptors in the brain versus promiscuous voles, which don't have nearly as many of those receptors in the brain. Most human behavioral traits have a polygenic basis and are influenced by the environment. So, what does that mean? What that means is that we don't really know, most of our behavior is not based on the effect of a single gene. But really, what it is it's the effect of a couple of genes, as well as your environment, and a lot of other things. So, the effects of a single gene among many may show a small statistical correlation between a particular allele and an increased tendency toward a particular human behavior. For example, some of us carry a gene that increases your chance of becoming an alcoholic, but there's so many more other factors involved than just that gene. For example, are you around alcohol? What is your socioeconomic status? What are your coping capabilities? So there's a lot more going on than just a gene that's going to influence if you become an alcoholic or not. Animal studies sometimes inspire human studies. For example, investigators are looking at possible connections between oxytocin and autism, a disorder involving social attachment. So if you see that promiscuous voles don't have many oxytocin receptors, so they don't become attached to other voles that they mate with, could there also be a connection between autistic children and oxytocin receptors in their brain, since they have a hard time making a connection with other individuals? So, genetic foundations. Genes that affect the ability to detect stimuli or to respond to a nervous or hormonal stimulation influence behavior. I expect you guys to know the vole, the larvae, and the garter snake examples for your exam. Some behaviors are inborn and be performed without any practice. Most behaviors, though, can be modified based on experience. I mean, just think about raising a young child. They don't understand not to bite and hit until they are told and taught not to bite or hit. All animals are born with a capacity for instinctive behavior, such as newborn coastal garters identifying a banana slug as food. Or, if you didn't know this, it's instinctive for human babies to latch onto a mother's nipples. They literally know how to find the boob as soon as they come out. Instinctive behavior is an innate response to a simple stimulus. Here's a great example of an instinctive behavior, the cuckoo bird. And please, please, please watch this video. One, it's hilarious, but two, it is such a great take-home message, and there will definitely be exam questions about the cuckoo bird. The life cycle of a cuckoo bird provides several examples of instinctive behavior. A female cuckoo lays her eggs in nests of other birds. So cuckoo birds are jerk birds. They're the biggest jerks of all the birds because instead of a female working hard to build her own nest, she just lays her eggs in other birds' nests. This is called being a brood parasite, which we'll learn about later on. When a cuckoo egg hatches, contact with the other egg stimulates a fixed action pattern. You can see this cuckoo bird and it's feeling an egg. And the fixed action pattern is for that blind hatchling to shove the other eggs out of the nest, eliminating any competition for food. So a fixed action pattern is a series of instinctive movements elicited by a simple stimulus carried out with little variation. So in this case, it's the cuckoo's egg dumping behavior. So instinctive behavior, a young cuckoo shoves its foster parent's eggs out of the nest. And the cuckoo's foster parents respond to the simple stimulus of the chick's gaping mouth with the fixed action pattern of parental feeding behavior. So they'll keep feeding this cuckoo bird, even though it's twice the size of the parents, which is really sad. Please watch this video. It is ridiculously hilarious, but it also is a great illustration of this action. Time-sensitive learning. A genetic capacity to learn, combined with actual experiences in the environment, shapes most forms of behavior. Learning may occur throughout an animal's life or be restricted to a critical period. For example, babies put things in their mouths and they learn very quickly what is palatable and what is not palatable. That's why you always see kids shoving things in their mouths, because that's how they learn. So a learned behavior is behavior that is modified by experience. Imprinting is a form of learning that occurs during a genetically determined time period early in life. For example, baby geese follow the large object that bends over them in response to their first peeps, usually their mother, and that's who they're going to follow. Unfortunately, this dog was the one who found the nest of baby birds before the mother. So now these birds who saw the dog first as they first opened their eyes are now going to follow that dog everywhere. So, imprinting is learning that can occur only during a specific interval in an animal's life. For example, these baby chicks learn who their mother is within the first moments of their lives, and then whoever they see first is who they believe will be their mother. There's a genetic capacity to learn combined with actual experiences in the environment that shapes the most forms of behavior. For example, songbirds. A male songbird recognizes his species song when he hears older males singing it. But if that male is reared with no models to sing, then he will sing a simplified version of the species song and he won't get nearly as many ladies. Many birds can only learn the details of their species specific song during a limited period of early in life. This is a great video that shows a bird that has learned all sorts of sounds to imitate to attract its mates, and it has to learn it very early on in life. So in this case, a male songbird, if he doesn't hear his species songs early on in life, then he will not be able to attract mates because he won't know the songs to sing to the ladybirds. Most animals are lifelong learners. They learn to associate certain stimuli with rewards and other stimuli with negative consequences. I think we see this a lot with our own animals. If you open up a bag of treats, your dog or cat are going to come running to you. But if you are, like example for cats, getting the cat carryout, take them to the vet, then they associate that with a bad experience. For humans, toddlers, unfortunately, they associate the doctor's office with shots because the very beginning of your life, every time you go to the doctor's office, you're getting shots. So the doctor is a very scary place. Classical conditioning is an involuntary response to a stimulus that becomes associated with this stimulus that accompanies it. An example would be Pavlov's dogs. So Pavlov's dog salivated at the sound of a bell associated with feeding time. So what Pavlov did was before conditioning, he noticed that every time you present the dogs with food, they would start to salivate. But if he rang a bell, they weren't salivating. So then what he did was he would ring a bell every single time he presented food to the dog. And eventually, the dog was conditioned to think that every time the bell rang, food was coming. So he would start to salivate or drool when the bell was being rung. This is called classical conditioning. There's also something called operant conditioning. This is when an animal is going to modify its voluntary behavior in response to consequences of that behavior. For example, a rat that presses a lever and is rewarded with food is going to press that lever over and over again. But if a rat receives a shock when it enters a particular area of a cage, it's going to avoid that area. Other types of learned behavior include habituation. This is when animals learn by experience not to respond to a stimulus that has either a positive or negative effect. For example, if you go to big cities like New York City or Washington, D.C., there may be a ton of pigeons on the ground. And what they learn is not to flee from people who walk past them because they're just so used to people walking past them all the time. So habituation is learning not to respond to a repeated stimulus. Spatial learning is animals learning about landmarks in their environment that help them return home. If you have an animal that lives outside, inside, and you're always wondering, how does my cat or dog know how to get home? That's based on spatial learning. There's also social learning, where animals learn to recognize offspring, competitors, or mates by appearance, calls, odor, or combination of cues. This might make you sad now that you go to Rouse's every time you pass the lobster tank, but lobsters will fight the first time they meet and then recognize one another for life. So can you imagine being shoved in a tank full of other lobsters and your claws are strapped together so you can't fight, so you're constantly agitated that you want to fight the person near you so you can recognize them later. And then something that us humans do all the time is observational learning. That's when animals learn skills by imitating behaviors it observes in others. So think about when you're learning how to dance or play a sport. You might imitate others until you get it. Instinct and learning. Instinctive behavior can be performed without any practice. Most behavior has a learned component. Even instinctive behavior is often modified over time. Some learning can only occur during a certain portion of the lifetime. And can you identify various forms of learned behavior? Let's talk about communication signals. Communication signals play a huge role in both cooperative and competitive behavior. Communication signals can be chemical, they can be acoustic, which means sound, they can be visual, like peacocking, showing off your feathers, or tactile, and the cue that is produced by one member of a species and detected and responded by other members of the same species. Pheromones are chemical signals. Examples would be a honeybee alarm pheromone, or sex attractants, priming pheromones. Bird songs and other animal calls are acoustic signals. They attract mates, define territories, and convey alarms. A great example of acoustical signals is the prairie dogs, which can alert all other dogs when it sees a snake or sounds an alert. This is a fantastic video that shows you a prairie dog colony who spots a snake, and you can actually see them using both tactile and acoustical signals to let everyone know to hide. Male baboons can threat display is visual signal that communicates readiness to fight. And most birds' courtship involves some coordinated visual signaling, so usually a dance or flapping of the feathers. Honeybees use a tactile signal to communicate the distance to a food source and its direction, and they use something called a honeybee dance. So this is a tactile communication, and what happens is the honeybees dance to tell the others where their food is in the hive. So they may run up the hive or down the hive to tell you where food is from the sun. Now, some predators have adapted these communication signals to get their prey. So predators sometimes use the signaling system for their prey against them. For example, a predatory female firefly may imitate flashing of a prey species to attract food. So she'll be like flashing her lights to attract males, and then when that male flies by, she will scoop him up and eat him. So animal communication behavior can only evolve if communication benefits both signal senders and signal receivers. Animals communicate by a variety of mechanisms. Can you identify those mechanisms? And predators sometimes take advantage of the communication behavior of their prey. Mates, offspring, and reproductive success. Sexual selection occurs when males or females of a species compete for access to mates, or when they are choosy about their mates. So think swipe left or swipe right. Parenting behaviors can also reflect different selective pressures operating on males and females. Sexual selection favors characteristics that provide a competitive advantage in attracting and retaining mates. Have you ever watched The Bachelor or The Bachelorette? Males usually maximize their reproductive success by mating as many times as possible, since sperm is a small and continuously replenished source. Females, on the other hand, are going to be much more picky about the males that they're going to mate with. And that's because females have a limited number of eggs to expend energy creating the offspring, and they're the ones that have to carry and care for that offspring. So usually females are going to be much more picky than the males, and there's different selection characteristics that a female may favor. For example, some women like tall men, some women like short men, some women don't like men at all. So those are all different characteristics that a female will use to select her mate. Here's a great example of sexual selection. The male hangfly will offer a moth to a potential mate. So he's literally going to take her out to dinner. A female hangfly only breeds with males who provide an energy-laden meal. So the male needs to provide a really good meal for the female to consider mating with him. Only after she's been eating for a few minutes will she accept the male's sperm. Now, if she finishes her meal before he does, she can break away. And if another male presents an even bigger dinner, then the female might dine and mate with him, replacing the first mate's sperm. So moral of the story, Don't take your dates to McDonald's. Take them for something really good, because if not, there's a good chance she's not going to mate with you. Another sexual selection is the female fiddler crabs assess their mates based on claw size and real estate. So female fiddler crabs choose mates with large claws who have built a burrow with the right location and size. If you guys have ever seen these guys, Telu's or fiddler crabs, they have one very large claw. And what they do is they wave it up and down and they basically say, "Hey baby, how's it going?" And the female crab, if she thinks he's cute and likes the size of his claw, then what she does is she will check out his burrow and decide if she wants to mate with him, as burrow location is important for the survival of their offspring. Now, don't we do this as well? Don't opposite sex try to attract each other by the way they dress or the cars that they drive? So maybe you meet a very good looking person at a bar who's dressed to the nine, but then you find out that they still live with mom and dad and can't pay their bills. So you may not want to mate with them. Another way animals do sexual selection is that they basically have a space where they will display themselves dancing and calling. An example would be the male grouse, which is these birds that converge at a lek. So a lek is basically a communal mating display area for males. The way I like to think of a lek is like a bar or a dance floor for humans. So like you go to a bar or a dance floor and you're showing off all your moves hoping that you will find a mate. This is the same as a lek. In species such as lions, elk, elephant seals, and bison, females cluster around a necessary resource. That might be food, it might be shelter, it could be water. And males may hold a territory that they defend from others. So the territory holder mates with all the females in his territory. So territory is a region that an animal or animals occupy to defend against competitors. When females choose among a group of displaying males, or males defend a mating territory, nearly all females mate, but many males do not. These systems impose strong selective pressure for mating traits on males, called sexual dimorphism. That means that there's distinct male or female phenotypes. So males will look very different from females. For example, the large claw on a male fiddler crab would be sexual dimorphism because female crabs do not have that large claw. Parental behavior requires an investment of time and energy that might otherwise be invested in reproducing again. Evolution of parental care requires that benefits to a parent, so increased offspring survival, has to be greater than the cost or loss of offspring opportunity or reproductive opportunity. Mammals are usually born in a helpless state, imagine a human baby, and so parental care is essential. Typically, the female is the sole caregiver. Males seldom serve as the sole caregiver. One example of males that are sole caregivers would be the midwife toad. What he does is he holds the fertilized eggs around his legs until they hatch. Most birds are monogamous and parent cooperate in caring for the young. So males and females maximize their reproductive success in different ways. Females tend to be choosier about mates than males. Monogamy is rare among animals, but it tends to correlate with parental care by both parents, and more often the females provide the parental care. Many animals benefit by clustering in groups. Birds, monkeys, meerkats, and other animals in social groups make alarm calls in response to a predator. For example, the sawfly caterpillar. These caterpillars benefit by living in a group because when they see a predator, they'll coordinate a response. The caterpillars feed on plants as a group, and when a predatory bird comes by, what they do is they literally will puke and spit at the bird together as a coordinated attack, which will scare the bird away from eating them. When animals cluster, some individuals shield others from predators. Preference for the center of the group can create a selfish herd in which individuals hide behind one another. So a selfish herd is a temporary group that forms when individuals cluster to minimize their individual risk of a predator. Many mammals, such as wolves, lions, wild dogs, and chimpanzees, live in social groups and cooperate in hunts. Cooperative hunting are not more efficient than solitary ones, but the major advantage of groups living lies in help fending off scavengers and caring for one another's young and protecting the territory together. So even though they may not benefit with hunting, they will be better at fending off scavengers and caring for each other's young. Group living also allows transmission of cultural traits or behaviors learned by imitation. For example, chimpanzees make the use of tools. They use thick sticks to make holes in a termite mound and then insert long, flexible fishing sticks into the holes. Different groups of chimpanzees use slightly different tool shaping and termite fishing methods. Here, you can watch a youngster learn by imitating adults. It's really adorable, actually. Many animals in permanent groups form dominance hierarchy, in which dominant animals get greater share of resources and breeding opportunities than subordinate ones. Example, in wolf pack, usually only one alpha male and one alpha female breed, but the subordinates get their chance to reproduce by outliving their dominant peer. So a dominance hierarchy is a social system in which resources and mating opportunities are unequally distributed within a group. In most habitats, cost of social living outweighs the benefit. So large social groups can attract more predators, and it can also lead to higher risk for parasites and disease. But at the same time, it might also lead to more parental care and guarding of the territory. Extreme cases of sterility and self-sacrifice have evolved in a few insects and one group of mammals. Ants, termites, honeybees, and mole rats are eusocial. That means they live in colonies with overlapping generations and have a reproductive division of labor. Most colony members do not reproduce, they assist their relatives instead. Workers often are highly specialized in form and function. For example, the honeypot ant worker, who literally will conserve water. They will give up their lives to conserve water for the other ants. A queen honeybee is the only fertile female in her hive. Sterile female workers feed larvae, clean and maintain the hive, construct honeycomb, gather nectar and pollen, and will sacrifice themselves to guard the hive. Male stingless drones subsist on food gathered by their worker sisters and fly each day in search of a mate. A sterile worker in a social insect colony is showing altruistic behavior. Basically, what altruistic behavior is a behavior that benefits others at the expense of the individual. And the theory of inclusive fitness is genes associated with altruism can be advantageous, and the expense of the behavior to the altruist is outweighed by the reproductive success of the relatives. So life in a social group has reproductive benefits and costs. Not all environments favor the evolution of such groups, and self-sacrificing behavior has evolved among few kinds of animals that live in large family groups. This is your vocabulary, and these are your student learning objectives.